What was the last book you've read? Was it Sherlock Holmes or Stephen King? Or the last TV shows you've watched? Was it a horror story? A murder investigation of whodunit? And have you ever thought about what they have in common? Edgar Allan Poe was an American short story writer, poet, critic, and editor. He's best known for his poetry and short stories of horror, mystery, and detective fiction. The Murders in the Rue Morgue, for example, revolutionized the short story genre. But how did Poe get there?
Poe was the son of the English actors Elizabeth Arnold Poe and David Poe. In 1811, his mother died from tuberculosis. His father left him and his two siblings, who were adopted by different foster parents. They've never seen each other again. His adoptive parents were wealthy tobacco merchants in Richmond, Virginia. From an early age, Poe showed interest in writing and poetry, but his godfather wanted him to stay in the family business. This caused conflicts between them during Poe's youth. In 1826, Poe attended the University of Virginia, but as he didn't receive enough money from his godfather to pay for his studies, he started to gamble to gain money. After accumulating a large debt, he had to abandon his studies. In 1827, in Boston, Poe published his first work, a pamphlet of poems named Tamerlane in Other Poems. He joined the army as a way to receive some financial aid, and with his godfather's help, he got into the military academy of West Point. 2 years later, Poe was expelled from the academy for not attending classes. He went to the New York City and brought out a volume of poems, with masterpieces showing the influence of John Keats, Percy Shelley, and Samuel Coleridge. Inspired by them, he published a new volume of poems. In 1835, back in Richmond, he worked as editor and critical reviewer of the Southern Literary Messenger. But some years later, he was dismissed, apparently for drinking problems. Poe did not spare critics of his literary peers and made some enemies in the way. In the same year, he married his cousin Virginia Clean. She is said to be only 13 when she married Poe, but some sources point out that she had already 14. Virginia was to become one of Poe's greatest inspirations to write.
Poe began to write some of his most famous stories. In 1839, he became co-editor of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine in Philadelphia, and began to write William Wilson and The Fall of the House of Usher, both supernatural horror stories. In 1841, he printed The Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first modern detective story. In 1845, working as a sub-editor of the New York Mirror, he published his most famous poem, The Raven, in the January 29th, 1845 edition. That poem made Poe become nationally famous. After that, he became editor of the Broadway Journal, where he republished most of his short stories. 2 years later, in 1847, Virginia died from tuberculosis. After her death, Poe had a brief engagement with the poet Sarah Helen Whitman. On October 7, 1849, in Baltimore, Maryland, Poe died. He was found in the streets, delusional, and taken to a hospital, where he died later. The official cause of death is unknown. He was buried in Westminster Presbyterian Churchyard. Poe's life was not easy. He lost his mother early and never saw his brother and sister again after being adopted. He had a complicated relationship with his foster parents. Also, he suffered from anxious depression and alcoholism. All of these traumas combined made it to his writing style. The writing style of Edgar Allan Poe is classified as romantic and dark romantic. However, it is possible to identify elements of Gothic literature in some of his works. The most notable features of Poe's works are themes involving death, madness, terror, horror, dreams, and trances, carefully constructed in his stories by the use of allegories and surreal and symbolic elements. Poe was also interested in science analysis focused on the study of mental states. Among his poems, the raven is the most read and iconic. The raven is considered to be a mystical animal and used widely in several works of fiction to portray mystery, horror, and bad omens. The raven has inspired the birds, the movie Raven, and gained even a parody from The Simpsons.
He has sent thee respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe and forget this lost Lenore.
Quoth the raven.
Nevermore.
The Raven is Edgar Allan Poe's most famous poem and responsible for making him noted nationally. The poem was written in 1845 and tells the story of a lover mourning the loss of his beloved, who starts to go insane when a mystical raven appears in his room in a dreary night. The psychological terror, hopelessness, suffering, and isolation of the bereaved person are the themes present in the poem, which are constructed from the use of figures of speech, allusions, and symbolism. Regarding his short stories, it is worth mentioning The Fall of the House of Usher, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Black Cat, The Mask of the Red Death, and The Pity and the Pendulum. The Murders in the Rue Morgue presents the first detective of the world, even before the term was even coined. August Dupin. Poe crafted the profession even before it existed. The story was inspired by a real case of a woman found dead in a river that was a scandal at the time.
Poe's works have a vast influence on literary, musical, and audiovisual arts. As examples of works and novels influenced by Poe are the writers Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie, who wrote detective stories with Hercule Poirot, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, and others. Poe was a pioneer in horror and detective stories. So next time you see a detective case or a horror story, ask yourself, does this have a reference or influence from Edgar Allan Poe?
And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting. Still is sitting on the padded bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore.